Welcome to Beyond Awareness Podcast, a conversation brought to you by United Against Human Trafficking, where we believe all people are deserving of freedom, resources, and support. Join us monthly as we educate, analyze, and connect with communities to examine the challenges of triumphs in the fight against human trafficking and explore what it truly means to support survivors. Without further ado, let's dive deeper, forever be students of one another, and unite together in the fight against human trafficking. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of the Beyond Awareness podcast. On this episode, we will explore the vulnerabilities foreign nationals face in human trafficking. Today, we have some wonderful guests with us. We have Samantha Ledezma, Davina Ugochukwu, Monica Holtcamp, and we want to thank you guys again for joining us. I would love for you to introduce yourself. So whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I can go first. So as Rhonda said, my name is Samantha Ledezma. I work at YMCA Community Impact Services, and I am the program director in our Trafficked Persons Assistance Programs, where we work with survivors of all ages.
Thank you.
And my name is Davina, and I am an attorney with Lone Star Legal Aid's Crime Victims Unit. I especially work with trafficking survivors to help with their civil legal services, or civil legal needs, rather. And that's a whole other thing. So.
Thank you.
My name is Monica Holtcamp. I serve as the executive director of a local shelter here in Houston, a nonprofit, and we are about to have our 2-year anniversary.
Congratulations.
Hey, that's exciting.
Thank you.
So we're going to dive right in and get started. I'm really excited to have this conversation and explore the vulnerabilities of that foreign nationals face. So let's jump right on in. My first question to you is, what makes foreign nationals more vulnerable to trafficking?
That's a great question. I think it's kind of a hefty one that can go different ways. But I think one of the main things can be the sort of the culture aspect, too, of many foreign nationals. Getting accustomed to what the laws are, getting familiar with the resources are, and also gaining familiarity and also trust with local law enforcement and state law enforcement. I think a lot of those aspects are things that perpetrators specifically will prey on and will see a vulnerability and take that as a means to gain control over the potential victim. And so I think definitely the culture aspect, not culture as in they're at fault, but someone preying on the barriers that exist for foreign nationals.
And I also want to mention that when it comes to culture, when I start thinking about how foreign nationals who are currently here and the culture that they carry with them from before they came here, that can also affect, them when it comes to being trafficked or exploited. And so, for example, I know I have family members, in West Africa who their parents weren't able to take care of them. So they asked other family members to take care of the children and, could they send them to school? Well, when the child was then given to the other family, that family actually treated their own, nephew, niece as a slave. And so, when you kind of then look at the cultural aspects of it back in the person's home country, that might be very normal. And they may not even think about it as trafficking now, maybe thought of as bad. Like I know my grandmother, she would take care of a lot of orphans on her farm because she didn't want them to be harmed by other people. But it wasn't seen as like this thing that police should necessarily be involved with. So I think that cultural aspect too.
That's really good.
And kind of tying into the cultural aspect, I think the definition of what trafficking is something that it's very broad, and it's also difficult for people to identify with. So that ties into culture because it is so normalized, as kind of Davina was sharing, that it's not seen as something negative. It's something that has been embedded as a survival mechanism throughout generations, that it's hard to break that cycle. And so when you hear someone sharing with you that you've been trafficked, whether it be, sexually trafficked or labor trafficked, it's almost a sense of, how did that happen to me? Mm-hmm. Are you sure that you're right? that this is something that I'm going through. And so really stripping it down to how we're defining it and adding in the cultural component to it makes all the difference in helping someone really connect with that is something that should not have happened. And how do we move forward in the repair process? Because it's also the generational trauma that's been compounded over generations that adds that component of cultural shame of, if I'm going through this, then that means my ancestors were also going through this. And how did that become normal at any point?
That's really good. And that leads, I would like to expound a little bit more on culture and how can we do better and what can we do more of to really get to our foreign nationals and help them to understand that there is help out there.
I think awareness, I know it sounds so old school and it sounds like 2000, like we got to make people aware. But I think in approaching awareness, it's been 26 years now since the first iteration of the TVPA has gone through. And I think the anti-trafficking world has come along, in knowing that you can't just say, are you being trafficked? You do need to say, are you being forced to do something that you don't want to do? Do you have to work when you don't want to? X, Y, and Z. But I think awareness, not just of what trafficking is, but what people's rights are. Mm-hmm. For foreign nationals, again, culturally, things that may be okay back home, we may not see as okay here. And just to be able to, especially in the workplace, just be able to put that out. In most of the world, for example, prostitution is not legal. Most of the world, I think, understands that. If they're coming to the U.S., they know it's not legal. But still, some people may not understand the fact that someone still can't make you do it. And so just because you are engaging in, quote unquote, prostitution through sex trafficking, we would hope that we would hope that people would feel comfortable enough, that we've done enough awareness that they can go seek help and not think I'm the one that's going to be in trouble because of this thing that I'm being forced to do. And then also awareness in the workplace, knowing that you should be paid what you were told you were going to be paid, knowing that you should never feel like you cannot leave your job because you may be harmed or someone may be harmed, making sure that those types of things are made known, to people as they're entering the workforce here or just here in the U.S.
I hear you, but I still feel like there's a barrier.
Mm-hmm.
Awareness is there, yes. But it almost feels like, because when you're talking to someone, a foreign national, the culture is what they are used to back home, and you say, do you feel safe? Or is there, some things that you're doing that you probably shouldn't do or you don't feel comfortable with? But they still have that cultural aspect of it. So how do you help them understand that I know that this is culture, but this is not right?
I think it also has to do with agencies that are working with survivors or really just the population of foreign nationals in any kind of service provision, understanding that we can make information available to them, but not operating maybe from the quote unquote expert role. I think with this community, as like many, the true sort of relationship building and rapport building of ensuring that if this population who are foreign nationals do not have trust in the system for valid reasons, that what are we doing as service providers to build that trust and to not operate from that role of, hey, what you're doing is wrong or what your family has done is wrong, but more so, let me make information available to you, allow you to make a decision based on what resonates with you. And these are sort of your options laid out of what we can do based on what your choices. And I think we talk about this in terms of any survivor, allowing them to make choices and being trauma informed in that capacity. I think it's no different in the way that we talk about building trust with communities that have been extremely harmed by systems. And that does include systems that are more expensive than just like law enforcement, but also social work spaces, school spaces, just all around.
Yeah. And to add also, I agree with what Davina and Samantha have shared. I think it starts with empowerment, right? If someone does not feel comfortable and confident in identifying, there will be no movement. I think secondary to that would be education and how those structures are being built, because oftentimes education comes with barriers themselves, and that can be accessibility, whether it be language. I think oftentimes, and kind of going back to your original question of what can we do better, I think we can do better by bringing in people who have gone through this process themselves, have some lived experience, and that builds the trust. So it starts from the ground up, and that starts by bringing in people who can speak to their experiences and encourage other people to also have the autonomy, right? The choice to make a report and what that looks like, and transparency that the process is not easy or simple or quick, but more so that this is the first step in a journey. And that, as in anything that has to do with legal processes, especially when it comes to immigration, it can take time. And so it also requires supports to be in place. And I think that's another barrier, is that once you make the report, you may not have someone who's guiding you through this process step by step. And that speaks to a larger systemic issue of, funding, nonprofits not having capacity. And, how do we work together in a coalition, right? And to support everyone that's doing the good work on the ground. But I think it starts from the bottom, right? And how do we make sure that a person that's walking into any public setting and says, I feel that maybe something is not right, that someone receives that without shame or cringing, and that person can speak to that individual in their language. And that too is hard because, language translation services are incredibly expensive, or it's hard to find that individual who speaks that specific dialect. And so just thinking about it from a holistic perspective, we always try to think from the ground up. How do you make things sustainable for the people doing the great work, but also how do you make it accessible?
That's really good stuff. We can probably stay on this all day, but I'm going to move on because some of the things you mentioned that really stood out to me is trust. That's really where it starts, trust. And trust is hard to build, and it takes time. And another thing that you said, Monica, was utilizing survivor leaders basically to help in this work. And it's so many there. While there's a large number of victims, there is a number of survivors and who would like to lead, and maybe tapping more into that to those survivor leaders to help us with the work. So thank you. So I want to ask this: how does fear of detention? And I know this one is something we talked about right before we started recording. So how does fear of detention or deportation stop people from asking for help?
A thought for me when it comes to deportation, and one of the really great, what do they call it, data sets or data points, is that many foreign nationals, whether they came with a visa or not, have actually been doing all the things that they're supposed to be doing, paying taxes, going to every single proceeding that a court asks for. So I do believe that when we say that people are fearful of deportation, I do think that people are already doing the things that they need to avoid that situation if possible, and get to a process where they can get some kind of status. Now, the people who may be fearful of deportation, I think that's I'm not saying that I don't think it's a majority of foreign nationals. I'm not sure, but just based on some of those data points. And I think that might be because they've been told that, especially with trafficking, right? They've been told, well, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to call, I'm going to report you, or, it's a form of control. And I know there's a whole bunch of other things, but
Yes.
that was the point that I wanted to make, and I'll stop there.
Yeah.
We're going to go there.
I'll wait.
We'll just go there lightly, though.
I think it's also the real threat that if someone has built a life here and, they are given options about reporting and having to interact with these systems, specifically sometimes with law enforcement when they are seeking a T visa, U visa, knowing that, they could face in reporting or being believed, the threat of being detained and having to, be deported to their home country where there is threat, whether it's violence, whether it's through a relationship or actual trafficking experience that they've already gone through in their home country or on their way migrating to the U.S. I think it's a threat that for some families or individuals, they might wait out and say, it's not worth reporting. It's not a risk that I'm willing to take, which I think is a valid point, given that some of our survivors do have history and trauma already from what that journey looked like.
Yeah. And that's really sad.
It's incredibly sad. I think right now we're operating under the assumption that the law will protect you. And so, unfortunately, that's not what we're hearing from our families. And so, from their perspective and point of view, what they've uplifted to us is that we rather not report, because even if there are protections for us, the law is not something that we see actively being followed. And so that's a valid concern, because it's correction on my part is that we're operating outside of the law, right? We're not following due process. And so it's not even things that we as practitioners in the community, as a social worker, that I'm sharing that as my opinion. This is what the community is sharing. So they're observing our own systems and legal processes not being followed. So what's the point of me putting myself, as Samantha mentioned, at risk when even the protections that are in place for me may or may not be followed?
Is there an influx of that going on right now, where people are just like, I'm just not going to say anything anymore? Where, you probably would have people willing at one point some years ago to come out and talk about it, but now currently deciding, what, just leave me alone.
I don't have a data point to kind of reference, but from the experience of working with families, I think giving them the options and, as we mentioned, building that trust with them, of informing them, as Monica said, like, these are the realities of what we're seeing, and also allowing them to have their options, but decide, what is the risk if I report or if I leave my trafficking situation? What are the resources or benefits that I can seek when there are so many changes ongoing as a state and also in the country, that I think there are changes, as well as there are stories that are happening. There was just a story in Maryland of a survivor who was able to report her trafficker, was able to apply for her T visa, was still detained, is in ICE custody, and as well as her trafficker is still out and about. And I think it's an example of kind of how the current landscape is affecting survivors, foreign nationals. And yeah, I think people are making the choice to really decide if that's something that they want to pursue, or if they want to take that huge leap and possibly risk the fact that the system might not operate the way that it used to, or as we expected it to.
Yeah. And I think what we're seeing as well is there's a larger systemic issue. So it's not unique to the now and present. I think there's a large financial component to it. So families are always going to survive and do what they need to in order to support their families. And so that really is part of the larger conversation when someone might bring to our attention that something might be happening that's outside of the normal. And so if we've identified, okay, maybe, minimum wage is not being provided, maybe you don't have a day off and working way over 40 hours a week. And so that might be brought to our attention and, kind of guiding that individual. It would be weighing pros and cons that they're comfortable with to say, how do we want to approach this? What are you comfortable with sharing? Do you want to make a report? Because you do have rights. And it's often that they don't want to go straight to reporting, but more of how do I mediate the conversation with my employer? And that could look like us helping them by guiding them on how to respond to that employer. It might be, hey, I didn't see a day off on my schedule. I really appreciate that you're giving me so much time. Please let me know when my day of rest might be. And then that person may respond. Maybe it was intentional. Maybe it was not intentional. But then they'll get a response like, oh, this is your day off. I'm so sorry. That was an oversight on our part. And so oftentimes families will go there first rather than saying, I'm going to lose that financial opportunity. But our community puts up with quite a bit in order to survive and be able to send money back home to their families. And so, again, it's kind of weighing pros and cons.
Both of you said something that I want to expound on a little bit. Samantha, you mentioned the situation in Maryland. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that's how fear gets into people, right? Because she's a survivor. She did all the things right. And here she's in custody. And the trafficker is out loose. That's on the news. Other potential survivors and victims see it and say, you know what use is it? Because this is what happened to her or that person or him. And so why should I come out and speak up? Yeah. So, would anybody like to expound on that a little bit? On, I don't know. I think maybe it's just me talking. No. But that's what I gleaned from what you just said.
I do think that I think I agree when it comes to a lot of, I don't see quite a big hesitation when we've gotten actually an influx of calls for immigration issues in the last half year, and people just trying to understand what their rights are and what their options are, as opposed to, now I will say, sorry, let me finish the thought, as opposed to I'm not going to go through with that process. Now, when it comes to crime victims, you are seeing where I don't want to report because I don't want to get involved with law enforcement, which is fine for something like a T visa for trafficking non-immigrant status. But for a U visa, that doesn't quite work, right? And trafficking victims can still apply for U visas if they would like. I wouldn't recommend it because if you're not going to report, let's go with the T visa where it's recommended but not required. But a lot of people are not, I don't see where people are shying away from immigration processes, but more so from interacting with law enforcement that they don't feel like they have to. They'd rather deal with an immigration officer or judge, I think, than law enforcement.
That's interesting. Monica, you said something, you were talking about economics and wages. And so I want to ask a question. How does economic exploitation like wage theft or debt trap people?
All the time. So working at a shelter, we've learned that the majority of our families, and it's something that we know actively happens even outside of the shelter network, right, is that families often pay someone to bring them from different countries. And so they're already, in most cases, indebted when they arrive. And it puts them in dangerous situations because they're working to pay that debt off, but also actively working to support their loved ones back home. Oftentimes it's elders that are sick and need medication or other family members who are experiencing something. And so their focus is solely on working and the financial component and that need. And in most cases, not getting paid minimum wage, getting paid cash, which also makes you more vulnerable to theft. It takes a really long time to save the money that they need in order to take care of these different situations. But on top of that, most of them want legal counsel. And legal counsel is incredibly expensive when you're paying for it in a private sector. And I'll let Davina speak to that a little bit more. She's smiling over here next to me because we definitely, as a coalition, have to work together even in our referrals to legal service providers because even that is limited. So kind of tying that into the education process is we do share with our families that it does take a while, not just because the system takes a long time, but because our friends doing the work on the ground also are limited in their capacities and time, and that the need is always grander than the availability. But the financial component is what really prevents people from making reports because they need that financial stability, not just for themselves. There's this greater purpose for them in that we're caring for our loved ones back home, and that we wholeheartedly understand and respect. And so typically families won't be at a point where they can make reports or even work with law enforcement or an attorney until they feel like they've stabilized.
And that can take a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I know you probably want to respond, but before you do, I want you to respond to this question as well, along with your response.
Yes.
And I want to talk about legal counsel and the exploitation with that.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to talk about.
So there you go.
Yeah. I am not one to bash anybody or speak badly about anybody or anybody's career path or anything like that. But one thing I learned, even as a student attorney in immigration court in law school, is that there are attorneys who are going to charge whatever because, again, they know that people feel like they need legal counsel. I have heard upwards of $37,000 for someone to prepare a simple form that in and of itself costed maybe $485 or whatever at the time, $360. And I think, when it comes to education, one of the things I love to tell people is that you really don't need an attorney for many things. There are a lot of things that people are able to achieve on their own. And I get it when you're busy, you got kids, you got your grandparents, you got to wire that money by Friday. I understand it's a lot going on. And then on top of that, all the forms need to be done in English, must be done in English, right? But that is why, attorneys are able to just be like, yeah, $8,000. And then there's another debt. We've seen where the person is paid and now their attorney is withholding the final documentation. So the person doesn't have the actual thing that they paid for until they pay more money, right? That is such a common thing. When it comes to reporting this type of behavior, a lot of people don't realize that they actually can report attorneys to their state bar, to the American Bar Association. You can make complaints, and there are different processes. But again, the attorneys, they may be in a contract, maybe it's not. But it's not like they're informing people of these things, right? Because they want to continue to exploit them. So I think it starts to feel normal. You've got the person that you paid to help you get here. You've got, your boss, $5 per hour is better than $0, right? Fine. And then you've got this other person. It's like all of it kind of works together. And those individuals don't even have to speak to each other. But they know that they can do this to this person because the person feels the need. I need to make money. I need an attorney. I need to be, So it's a whole system that I hope communities and service providers and people like me can do a better job of instilling kind of this safety net within the individuals, that I can do this on my own. And here's how to do it. Translation services are difficult, but libraries have a lot of really great resources. Google is free. I'm not saying it does a great job, but it's better maybe than paying, a service if you can't afford it. So there are many resources out there, but a lot of people are just not aware. And when you're busy, it's hard to be aware of those things. And I get that.
So kind of what you're saying is, I have on here, I mentioned with this previous question is about, it's a trap. So you have exploitation everywhere. The people who are paying you, where you live, attorneys, everyone And so being a foreign national is just like one big trap sometimes. And not everyone, not 100%, but a large number. And I know we don't have numbers that probably are true numbers, but a number of people I can imagine just feel trapped. Let's talk about the financial aspect of trafficking.
Yeah. I mean, trafficking, that's the only reason why it exists is money. Drug trafficking exists because of money. Arms trafficking exists because of money, and human trafficking. When we're talking about trafficking and you're looking at it from a trafficker's point of view, it is really about how can I make the most amount of money without expounding a lot of resources that I do or don't have, right? That's how rich people stay rich, get rich. And when we're talking about trafficking, then you go all the way back to just like even the African slave trade. I mean, it's about money, right? If I can get people to produce a lot of resources without me having to pay them or properly feed them or house them, then I win, right? So I think that a lot of people believe like sex trafficking, that's it. And they think it's this focus on abuse and sex. And it's not. And I know it sounds horrible, but really the sex is just to get to the money. And that's the more important part. With human trafficking, you can use people over and over and over again until it makes them a very valuable asset to traffickers, right? I'm not calling people are not assets ever, 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 ever. But from the trafficker's point of view, that is kind of how they are looking at people.
They see it as a business.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the human being, right? It's the business part. And so that's what makes it even more painful, because you see it on TV or the, movies. It's kind of glamorized as this, sexual exploitation. That's all it is. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what the public tends to think that it is only, which is also why it's so hard to define.
Yeah, I think we mentioned a little bit about how labor exploitation exists on that spectrum, working itself up to labor trafficking. And I think, a lot of what our systems are built on is cheap labor and exploitation of the worker. And so that does fall on that spectrum of exploitation, and it can become it can work itself all the way up to labor trafficking, and even just the exploitation of humans and their labor. I think, one, it's obviously exploitative, but it's what generates money, and it's what makes per capita makes more money for these people who have businesses or selling a product or selling a good. And then on the sex trafficking side, I totally agree, Davina. I think it's a lot more than just, as you said, it sounds horrible, but it's a lot more than just the sex. It's what it's producing for the traffickers, and it's what's making this an industry.
Mm-hmm. And just a couple points when we talk about businesses, when I am speaking in my other role as a business coach and consultant, I'm working with survivors who are starting businesses around advocacy. And if they're, we're talking business, right? And they're like, my trafficker used to say things like that. I'm like, yeah, because they are trying to make it less horrible, but also they're showing you I am a business person. And so a lot of the terms, it's such a weird thing because it's like, Davina, we can't say that. I'm like, that's how the business world works. And it's a very weird, confusing, thing. But that was something I, noticed.
So greed and the need for power is two very important components.
And America was built on slavery. That's the culture. We talked about culture, and we are still almost 500 years out working through building up our own culture and trying to be, we have the Trafficking in Persons report, right? The world asks us, why is America the one to say how to rank, while y'all are still working through your own problems? Mm-hmm. And so I think when it comes to culture here in the U.S., we are still trying to move forward in all these different ways. Some we've done okay in, and we still have a long way to go in so many different places.
Let's talk about racism and gender biases. What extra challenges do people face when racism or gender bias is added on top?
Yeah, it's a hard question. I think there's a misconception, right, that the only survivors of human trafficking are women.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a huge barrier to reporting as well, because maybe services are only available for women. So there's a misconception, and that's a bias maybe because you see a female and you want to help versus the male has to be strong. But we know a lot of males are human trafficked, and they themselves are still kind of learning what that looks like for themselves and how to make that report. So I think that plays a huge part in how someone is able to access support systems for trafficking situations, especially if they're not feeling welcome. So if there is a racial component, then they may not report at all, right? Am I safe to do so? Am I going to be targeted because of the color of my skin? Am I going to be deported? Am I going to be arrested? And that's a more prevalent fear that I hear from male community members that are Black and brown.
Yeah, I think there's not a lot of services for men who have been trafficked, whether it's sex trafficked, labor trafficked. I think when you look at the landscape, even adult services, but then adult services for men, and then adult services for men survivors who have been labor trafficked. I think it's scarce. And then when you start working, specifically talking from the standpoint of like case management, when you start looking at other resources like shelters, sometimes that creates even more barriers for men who are survivors. And it can feel unwelcoming. It can feel like, oh, this isn't designed for me, so I must not be a survivor. And on the talking point of how racism kind of affects trafficking survivors as well, I think for Black girls and brown girls, that looks so different. Mm-hmm. We are at a certain age adultified, and we aren't seen as potential victims, and that is very different to our white counterparts. And, you know, when we talk about trafficking as a society and in the culture and films and all of this, I think oftentimes, maybe not always, but we are talking a little bit more the representation of a white victim survivor. And for brown and Black girls, that's entirely different. I think the conversations start to be, oh, was that optional? Or, oh, is that a sex worker?
Mm-hmm. I think looking at the history of trafficking, modern day slavery, right, it started in Britain, right? And it was this fear of these immigrants are coming into Britain and they're enslaving our white women. They are forcing them into prostitution. Everybody wants a white woman. And so, you know, they're going to make them do all these things. And what that immediately did was completely cut out more than half of victims, right? And it completely ignored labor trafficking. And then as we started to bring modern day slavery, and here in the U.S. we call it human trafficking, well, it was still considered white slavery. And it was the blonde hair, blue-eyed girl who was being kidnapped. And I mean, aside from the fact that we know most trafficking situations, it doesn't behoove a trafficker to do kidnapping, right? That's just not, that doesn't make the most money. Grooming is a much better way to keep somebody under your control. Again, that idea then started where people are like, no, men and boys are not trafficked. And then when it comes to, you know, Texas, we know that when it comes to labor trafficking, the majority is, I believe it's migrant male workers who are over the age of 18. When it comes to sex trafficking, it is Black girls who are 15 to 24. If you told that to people, they would probably be like, what the heck are you talking about? You know, because, again, it just doesn't gel with this history that people have been fed for so long. And a quick story is, I can't remember, it was a white woman and a Black woman, 17, 18, barely women, both arrested for prostitution. The officer lets the Black woman go. White woman's like, why didn't you let me go? And he's like, you should know better. and both of them were actually being trafficked by the same people. And so it's just this idea, like, the Black girl, of course, that's her life. That's what we expect of them.
What she wanted.
That's what she wanted. Well, that's what we expect. We don't expect that from you. So also going, when it comes to bias, I mean, it is hard to get over systematic bias. I mean, I have gone with labor trafficking victims to report to HPD and have been told that I am talking to an extortion victim. And I'm literally with the law books like, this is trafficking. Just pretend it's sex, and then you will see it.
Yeah.
And, having to be there for 4 hours, just literally trying. And I'm like, no, she's tried this twice. We're going to do it today. And it's just like, some people they refuse. They're like, this is what it is. And that's it. I think it goes beyond ignorance, but that's just me. But yeah, I think there's a lot that we don't want to see when it comes to systems and how they affect racism, gender bias, gender identity. That's a big one. LGBTQ community, straight track to trafficking, right?
Huge.
And morality, this weird idea of morality and why it's okay for certain people to be in those positions, or why people may be, on a fast track to trafficking because my morals don't allow me to have a gay child. Right. So, there's a lot to unpack there. Those are dissertations.
And some people just, it's some systems. I don't want to name the systems. They just don't want to address it. Especially what we were talking about earlier was, they will address sex trafficking. Labor is a whole nother beast, right? And so people are out here not getting the help that they need because we are simply not addressing labor trafficking. So let's kind of shift a little bit because we are getting close to time. So I want to go through to support and, how can we let our listeners know, some things that we can do and to step forward and do better, because that's the reason why we're here. So what does good culturally aware support look like?
I think it looks like meeting the person where they are. And so understanding where the individual in front of you has come from will open the door for understanding. And this is before you even get to the education component or let me provide you referrals here. It's more of you have to start with the trust in any aspect. So starting with the trust, starting with an open mind of how you're learning from that individual. I'm not giving you information, learning about what your experience has been and how do I connect you to the most trusted resources that we could potentially have. We can't do it alone. We're not all experts in everything, right? I need legal service providers to help. I need, YMCA to help. And so really it's an understanding of each other and our awareness around how we can support the individual is the best way to start, because that's the point of trust is really going to be, can you provide me a person that can speak to me in my language, right? Can you provide me with a trusted space where other people cannot hear the conversation that we're having? So it seems very basic, but it's not always as readily available as we would hope, right? Because sometimes we are in open spaces. The structures that we have in place are not always private or confidential, but we have to create the space, right? And then after building the trust, then I can say, here's this wonderful group that I partner with. I trust them wholeheartedly. I've worked with them. I know what their processes are. And these are the, very intimate questions that they have to ask you. It's tied to maybe the funding that we get. It's not because they want to be invasive and learn all about your private details. And then maybe there's some questions that you can opt out of. So learning it myself before I even recommend it to someone else so that I can better explain it to someone. But it definitely starts with the trust component, and how we can do better, I think, is just by expanding our awareness of what everyone is doing not leading with judgment, because every nonprofit has different processes, different funding sources, and all of that is tied to different requirements. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding that happens. So I think banding together in a more cohesive way is the way we can proceed in opening doors of understanding. And then that really trickles down to how we're communicating that information to the folks that are trusting us with that information.
I think also operating from, I'm a social worker, so from a strengths-based perspective, I think non-social workers can still do that in their realm of practice. I think, specifically, I oversee case management, and I think if we're going to pitch a resource or a community resource, but the client's saying they get this need met in this other way that's providing community and it's bringing comfort, I think kind of rolling with that, knowing that they are the expert in their lives and what's already in place that they're doing and how do we build onto that, not completely come in and change it. I think language is a thing that definitely does help. Obviously, being able to communicate with someone in your language already can assist that. At the same time, I think knowing that we're lifelong learners, and just because I speak my client's language doesn't mean I can't harm them if I'm not giving them that chance to kind of lead me in where they want to go. Specifically speaking, as an example, I come from Mexican parents, but my story might not be the same as someone who is from Guatemala or Honduras. And knowing that not just because I have a similar background or speak your language, am I going to know what's best for you? So I think that's really being culturally practicing that cultural humility within service providers and knowing, okay, where do I kind of have you lead me and work off those strengths?
I think just having that open mind. So exactly what y'all both said. Lifelong learners, realizing that not everybody's background is the same. But also, as in my background, I may be from Nigeria and the survivor I'm providing services to may be from Nigeria, maybe the same tribe, but that doesn't mean much, right? In terms of we may not have the same experiences. Mm-hmm. But also just being open to the fact that no two victim and no two survivor are the same. Mm-hmm. And there may be stories, like I can say, I've been in anti-trafficking work since 2006. I've heard it all. Well, not really, no. And just being open to survivors look different. I have survivors who are senior age. Mm-hmm. I have survivors who are children. I've had survivors from 8 different African countries, like 4 different Asian countries, all speaking different languages. So very diverse, and being open to that, being open to receiving that, and working the law to make sure that I can still serve them with those, fact patterns, their stories.
What about the community? What can the community do to not just build trust, but to raise awareness, and things that the community can do, and what should they not do?
I think for the community to have these conversations about education and prevention, I think you can't have conversations about prevention without including racial justice, economic justice, and immigrant justice. I think, and that goes to say for a lot of the social injustices that exist for society as a whole, I think we can't talk about wanting to prevent trafficking without understanding how these different barriers create the trafficking in the first place. I think we had tidbits through our conversation about how economic justice can be a big thing, that if we had a sustainable minimum wage, right? Like, I think that, not that would solve trafficking, but these are the things that we should be looking at that at the end of the day do connect to how exploitation will rise on the first hand. And so I think having conversations about this, also listening to survivors, listening to what they're recommending, what their experiences have been, and as service providers, knowing that just because we've done things a specific way in the past, I think we're still learning. And so operating from a survivor's perspective of like, where do we shift? Where do we change? Or where is Where's the movement going to be most effective and not being tied to we've always done it this way. And that goes for outreach or education or just like service delivery as a whole.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Samantha shared. I would say also for the community not to make assumptions. And so it goes back to that education and learning what human trafficking is, not making assumptions. And if you hire someone, you have the opportunity to do that, pay the minimum wage, right? It's easy oftentimes for community members. We see this all the time is I'm going to, hire someone to help me with my home cleaning. I'm going to hire someone to help me with my child care. And man, that's affordable, right? Just make sure you're paying the living wage, and that will go a long way.
Be fair.
Mm-hmm.
Be fair.
Be fair. Treat people the way you want to be treated.
Period. If everybody lived that way,
I know.
if that's all you had,
That's just what I got from what Monica just said.
Mm-hmm.
Be fair.
Yeah.
So thank you. You want to add, or you don't have to? It's fine.
I will say community is a hard thing for me. I've never felt like I was ever part of one community. So I always wonder, like, what does that actually look like for people? And I think, when I am interacting with survivors, one of the biggest things is they feel alone, like very alone. And so it makes me wonder, what does community look like for that person? And then how can we get that person to connect with community if it's important? I know a lot of people it's easy to turn to church, right, for community. The only thing I would say is that sometimes when it comes to religious backed things is that there are assumptions, there may be judgments. If someone's been sex trafficked, God forbid you enjoy sex, right? There are all these things that can come with that community. So I think for me, I would really wonder, what can community look like? And how can people connect to that community in a way that they feel safe? Communities are always going to make mistakes, made up of people. So that's expected. But, what does that mean for people? That's where I would start. Yeah.
So I'm still on community. I'm on the neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
And what they see or what they think they see. What should they look out for when it comes down to potential labor trafficking in someone's home, or what does that look like? Mm-hmm. And also, as you respond to that, I still have be fair in my brain and be kind in my brain. So what does that look like?
I think it has typically, and it's funny because that type of trafficking, I don't care if you're in DC, I don't care if you're in Texas, California, it almost always kind of looks the same. Where neighbors are seeing that there's someone else living in the house. The person doesn't interact with anybody else. And they don't see them much alone outside, right? If they are outside, they're usually doing work, yard work. And again, for my experience, typically what I've seen is that a neighbor then was walking, their dog, and hi, and then there was a stern look from somebody, and they're like, what's going on? I've also seen typically or for me at least, not me, my clients, where they felt like there was a threat. They were about to be moved. They knew they were going to, nobody really would know where they are if they were moved, and then that's when they decided to run to a neighbor's house and ask for help, right? Or a neighbor,
That's brave.
Very brave. But I've seen that a few times. I've also seen where a person was like, they just asked somebody walking, how much should nannies get paid? Oh, they should get paid, $500 per week. And they're like, oh, wow, I'm only getting paid $100 per month. And that kind of started the conversation where people are like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. They go home, they talk to their spouses, their children, and someone's like, that sounds like exploitation or trafficking. I've seen that a few times as well. I think just noticing almost, which is hard.
Being aware.
It's hard in today's world.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think kind of speaking to that as well is just being inquisitive. If someone's asking you, like the neighbor who was talking about getting paid $100 per month, that's wild. So asking more, right? Not trying to press but wow, yeah, $500 a week. $100 is nothing. And just kind of gently being inquisitive. I think people often see or hear things, and as a community, we just kind of shy away from the conflict it could potentially bring us, right? I think also being brave in the sense that, here's this person who's being brave in front of you, brave enough to tell you that they're only getting paid $100 per month. What are you going to do with that, right? You're not just going to look away. Be brave, lean into that and say, how can I help you? And they may not know the answer to that, right? They may look at you funny because no one's ever asked them that question probably. But kind of speaking to something that Samantha said earlier, they're going to let you know what they need. Mm-hmm. They have something in mind because they were brave enough to bring it to you to begin with.
Yeah, I always get stuck on this kind of like red flag question because I think there are, some common things. At the same time, as Davina said earlier, just being in the space for a couple of years, I know I haven't seen it all. And so something new is going to come up. And I think that's speaks to the fact that every sort of situation looks very different. And so what I kind of go back to, and I think you guys both spoke to, is being curious and knowing who your neighbor is in this example, right? But also we operate a hotline in the Houston area. And often what we see is it is a neighbor, it's a church member, it's a hospital staff. It's somebody who took the time to say, something's a little off here. Let me continue to conversate with this person. Let me see what I can gather. Mm-hmm. And then, we've had calls where folks say, hey, I just Googled human trafficking in Houston and we saw your hotline and we can't confirm if this is trafficking because, I'm just learning about it, but we called you all and can you guys help? Mm-hmm. And so I think that speaks to the talking points of you two that it's about curiosity and knowing, okay, where can I be brave to help this person who I might be that connection to get them a phone number or to connect them to someone who speaks their language. And then, I think that can do so much wonders.
And I think, sorry, can I tell this one quick story?
No, you're fine.
So even just taking it back where a family member of mine, born and raised in Nigeria, they were being trafficked by family members when their parents had to give them away to family members for some time. And I remember, they would go to school late because they have to get the kids ready, they have to get them fed, and then they could take their own bath and eat and go to school. And they were excellent at school. They were doing really great. But they would get a whooping every day because they were late. Finally, a teacher was like, what is going on? Your head boy, but you're always late. And just that question allowed my family member to be able to say, oh, this is what's going on. And I can't remember all of what happened after that, but I know that the person no longer got in trouble in school. I do believe that teachers started to be more mindful of the situation and kind of just be more helpful towards getting the person out of that situation. That was in the 60s in Nigeria, So I think just noticing and, again, just being inquisitive and even being brave. And, now we have Google. You can just put in, a lot of people do just put in searches. They'll find, I guess, human trafficking. They'll find legal aid or whatever. So, yeah.
That's good. You mentioned teachers. And I'm glad you did. And we won't expound on that, but that's another, that's the only help victims may have. So just people paying attention, being aware is what is really important. So we're going to end on this. What resilience have you seen in survivors navigating these systems? And I want to ask that question because I want to give people hope.
Yeah.
And I think these stories give listeners hope.
So I was just at a conference where they talked about resilience and also how instead, what is the resistance that we're seeing? And I think just an example of what I saw yesterday with a survivor I was talking to was that, she's had several experiences operating through different systems, seeking resources, seeking benefits, where she's felt disregarded or, like somebody is not going to listen. And she, has taken the time to, hang up. That person wasn't helpful and then call again. And I was asking her, sort of what that's like to know, okay, I'm going to call again because I'm going to resist. I'm not going to just, which can be extremely, hard and can be extremely draining for the individual who's already navigating so many other things. But that kind of comes up to my head right now with your question, that I think a lot of our clients, they're resisting. They're saying, okay, if this isn't working because the system's not working, what can I do to resist, whether it's through community, through myself, or with my family? And I think that's where often we're seeing some of the success stories.
That's great.
Yeah. And, oftentimes our families humble us quite a bit. And one of the things that they often say is that we don't have the luxury or the privilege to sit in our sadness or fear for too long. We have to move forward. And that also keeps us as practitioners moving forward, because it can be hard.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have no business, being sad for too long as practitioners, because our families are moving forward, right? If they don't have the privilege, then neither do we.
Wow, that's good.
That is good. I just think that those who, just the idea of being a survivor, right? Whether we know a person is a survivor, whether they made an outcry, but even just being resilient in a trafficking situation, waking up each day, getting to the next day, I think that is, to me, speaks volumes on survivors. And to me, it just shows just something inside that's like, I've got to push through. Maybe one day this will end, but I've got to push through. I don't know. That is really remarkable to me. And then even afterwards, so many survivors, what do? Advocacy work for free, which is inappropriate, but for free, and that also speaks volumes to something really bad happened to me. And I really want to help other people who are in that situation, or to prevent it from happening. So it's a lot of hope. I think it is a lot of hope, in doing anti-trafficking work, especially from a survivor's point of view, I think. Well, I'm not a survivor. I'm an ally, but looking at it, from a survivor's point of view.
Thank you.